I never thought a fishing dock could start a war, but that's exactly what happened. One Thursday morning, I walked down to the lake with a thermos of coffee in one hand and an old tackle box in the other, and where my dock had stood for almost 40 years, there was nothing but water. Not storm damage, not decay, not some accident. It was gone, ripped clean out of the shoreline like it had never existed. The first thing I noticed was the silence. See, when you've lived beside a lake long enough, you get used to things staying where they belong. Trees stay rooted. Rocks stay put. Docks stay attached to the shore. That morning felt wrong before my brain even caught up with what my eyes were seeing. Pieces of treated lumber floated near the reeds. One broken post bobbed in the water about 20 feet from shore. Fresh machine tracks cut through the mud. Somebody hadn't just removed my dock, they'd erased it. I stood there staring for what felt like an hour before I finally looked across the cove. That's when I saw the new resort catching the morning sunlight. All glass walls and expensive balconies, sitting where an old pine grove used to be. The place was called Silver Ridge Shores. Fancy name. Fancy prices. Fancy people who came up from the city on weekends pretending they loved nature while complaining about bugs. The resort had opened 6 months earlier, and from day one there'd been tension. Nothing direct at first. Little comments. Little looks. The kind of stuff that tells you somebody thinks they own more than they actually do. My name's Cole Bennett. I was 58 at the time, born in that county, raised on that lake. My grandfather bought the property in 1952 after coming home from Korea. Back then there weren't vacation homes, resorts, or investors looking for lakefront opportunities. Just fishermen, farmers, and people trying to make a living. The dock had started as a weekend project between my grandfather and his brother. A handful of cedar posts, some rough boards, and enough stubbornness to get the thing standing. My father rebuilt sections of it every few years. Then eventually it became my responsibility. I'd replaced boards, reinforced supports, patched storm damage, and spent more evenings sitting at the end of that dock than I could count. My wife, Karen, used to sit there with me before cancer took her. My son learned how to cast from that dock. Hell, I'd probably cried on that dock more than once after everyone went home and nobody was watching. So when some stranger looked at it and saw an obstacle to a better view, they weren't seeing wood. They were looking at pieces of my life. Around noon, I drove over to the resort office. The lobby smelled like lemon polish and money. Behind the front desk sat a young woman who looked nervous the second I introduced myself. She made a phone call, and 5 minutes later a man in a gray suit came walking out. Perfect haircut, perfect smile, perfect kind of guy who'd never repaired anything with his own hands. "Mr. Bennett," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Trevor Lang, Operations Director. How can I help you?" I ignored the hand. Somebody tore out my dock. His smile didn't disappear. It just changed shape. The waterfront structure. Waterfront structure. That's what he called it. Like it was a traffic cone. "Yeah," I said. "My dock." He folded his hands together. "According to our consultants, that installation presented visual inconsistencies with the shoreline development plan." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so ridiculous my brain didn't know what else to do. Visual inconsistencies? The structure lacked updated permitting documentation. It was built before your consultants were born. Unfortunately, compliance standards evolve. That's when I realized something. Trevor wasn't apologizing because he didn't think they'd done anything wrong. Somewhere along the line, these people convinced themselves that money outranked history, that buying land nearby somehow gave them authority over everybody else. I leaned closer across his desk. "You destroyed private property." His smile finally cracked a little. "Our legal department disagrees." I nodded slowly. Good. Good. Yeah. Because now we're having the same conversation. I left before my temper got the better of me. The drive home took 15 minutes. The anger stayed a lot longer. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on my porch watching moonlight bounce across the water, trying to figure out what bothered me most. The dock itself was replaceable. Lumber could be bought. Posts could be driven into the lakebed again. What bothered me was the arrogance. The assumption that because they had investors and lawyers and architects, they got to decide what mattered. Around midnight, I grabbed a flashlight and started walking. There's an old dirt road that snakes through the hills behind the lake. Most people use the paved entrance now, but locals know the original route. As I followed it through the trees, something tugged at the back of my memory. My father used to talk about that road. Not often, just random stories while fixing engines or cleaning fish. I remembered him mentioning property lines one time. Easements. Survey markers. Things I didn't care about when I was 20. But standing there in the darkness, hearing gravel crunch beneath my boots, I suddenly wondered if maybe I should have listened more carefully. The next morning, I climbed into my truck and headed toward the county records office, not because I had a plan yet, but because something in my gut kept telling me there was a piece of this story nobody at Silver Ridge Shores knew existed. And by the time I pulled into the parking lot, I was determined to find it. When I walked into the county records office that morning, I didn't have some grand plan. I didn't even have the right words for what I was looking for. I just knew there was a gap in the story that didn't make sense. The clerk behind the counter, an older woman with reading glasses hanging on a chain, asked for my parcel number, and I handed her what little paperwork I had on my property. She disappeared into the back for a while, and I just stood there listening to the hum of fluorescent lights, thinking about my dock floating in pieces somewhere out there in the lake. When she came back, she had a thin folder in her hands. Nothing impressive at first glance, just worn paper and stamped pages. But the moment I opened it, I felt something shift. There it was, a construction access agreement from years ago, signed between the previous landowner and a development company that no longer existed under the same name. It was simple on the surface, almost harmless sounding. Temporary access for construction vehicles to reach the lakeside development zone during building phase, with clear language that said the easement would expire upon completion of construction unless renewed in writing. I read it twice, then a third time slower, because sometimes your brain needs time to accept what your eyes are already telling you. That road behind the resort, the one I had just walked the night before, the one everyone assumed belonged to Silver Ridge Shores, didn't actually belong to them in the way they thought it did. It crossed my land for the steepest final stretch before reaching the lakefront. And according to this document, that right-of-way wasn't permanent. It was conditional, temporary, and it had never been renewed. I remember laughing under my breath right there in that quiet office, not because it was funny, but because it was almost unreal how something so small on paper could explain so much arrogance in real life. I asked the clerk if this was enforceable, and she just shrugged like people do when they've seen too many land disputes to be surprised anymore, and said, "If it's recorded like that, it's enforceable unless challenged in court." That was all I needed. I didn't go home right away. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for a long time staring at the folder on the passenger seat, thinking about Trevor Lang's polished smile, about visual inconsistencies, about how casually they tore out something that had been in my family longer than most of their investors had been alive. It wasn't anger anymore at that point. 6 steel posts stood in a perfect line beside the bridge entrance like silent boundary markers, impossible to ignore and impossible to argue with. I didn't say a word when Cole showed up an hour later, standing at the edge of his resort's access path staring at what had just changed everything. He asked me what I thought I was doing, and I told him I was protecting my bridge, the same bridge his crews had nearly destroyed twice already. His face tightened, and he said I was cutting off emergency access to a major hospitality property, and I remember answering him very clearly. "No, I'm enforcing the property line your own lawyers just confirmed exists." The first real consequences hit faster than I expected. Within 48 hours, their winter fuel trucks had to reroute nearly 2 miles through a narrow forest road that hadn't been used in years. Maintenance crews were delayed, guest services slowed down, and the boiler system that heated the lakeside cabins started running on tighter margins than they were designed for. Then came the timing problem they hadn't considered. New Year's week, the most profitable stretch of their entire season. I could hear it in Cole's voice when he called again, the frustration starting to crack into panic as he explained that guests were already complaining about luggage being carried through snow, that VIP bookings were getting nervous, that cancellations were starting to stack up. I didn't respond with anger or satisfaction, just silence, because at that point it wasn't personal anymore. It was structural. The resort had built its convenience on top of my land and never bothered to secure it properly, and now winter was exposing every shortcut they had taken. The breaking point came on the 3rd day after the posts went in. A high-profile guest group arrived and refused to continue their stay after watching staff struggle to move their luggage through deep snow while trucks idled far away on the wrong side of the forest route. By evening, the calls shifted from complaints to negotiations. First came an offer of $20,000 for temporary access resolution, which I declined without even thinking. Then $40,000 framed as a goodwill gesture. Still no, I wasn't trying to punish them, but I also wasn't going to sell back what was already mine just because their timing was bad. By the fifth day, the tone changed completely. The resort owner himself called, no longer pretending this was a misunderstanding. He laid out a new proposal, $110,000, a 15-year winter access agreement, full reconstruction of my bridge with steel reinforcement, heated snowmelt strips at the entrance, protective barriers for plows, and a written penalty clause for any future snow encroachment onto my side of the property. It was the first time anyone had acknowledged the bridge itself as something worth respecting instead of ignoring. I told him I would review it, and for the first time, I wasn't sure if I felt victorious or just tired. Because standing there looking at those steel posts in the snow, watching a luxury resort scramble because of something they had dismissed as a minor inconvenience, I realized the real conflict was never about snow or bridges at all. It was about the assumption that convenience always outranks ownership, and for the first time in years, that assumption had just cost someone a fortune. And what happened next made it even worse for them. The final negotiations didn't feel like a victory the way people imagine it. There was no dramatic music in my head, no sudden rush of satisfaction, just a quiet heaviness like the air after a long storm when everything is finally still, but you're not sure yet what the damage report will say. Pine Harbor Lodge reached out early that morning, and instead of another phone call from a manager or a lawyer, the owner himself showed up in person, which already told me more than any apology ever could. He stood at the edge of my bridge entrance, looking at those steel posts we had installed days earlier, and I could see it in his posture that this wasn't about confusion anymore. It was about consequence. The kind of consequence people only accept when it starts touching revenue charts and guest cancellations. He tried to start with something soft, something like, I think we both got caught in a bad winter situation, but even he didn't sound convinced by his own words. I told him calmly that winter didn't create this. Decisions did, and silence did, and the assumption that my property was just a convenient extension of his resort did. That landed harder than anything else I could have said, because there wasn't anything emotional in it, just fact. He paused for a long time, staring out toward the lake like maybe the answer was floating somewhere on the water, then finally admitted they had underestimated how dependent their entire winter operation was on that single access path crossing my land. That was the first time anyone from their side actually said it out loud without excuses wrapped around it. When he finally presented the full proposal, it wasn't the same tone as before. There was no bargaining confidence left, just structured survival thinking. $110,000, 15-year winter access easement, full reconstruction of my bridge with steel reinforcement, heated snowmelt strips embedded into the entryway, engineered plow deflection barriers so nothing could ever be accidentally pushed across my line again, and a penalty clause that financially punished any violation of my property boundary, even if it was accidental. It was almost ironic, because everything they were now offering as premium infrastructure improvements was essentially just what should have existed in the first place if anyone had respected the boundary from the beginning. I didn't rush the signature. I sat with it for a moment longer than they probably expected, not because I was unsure about the terms, but because I was thinking about how many small ignored warnings had stacked up to get to this exact page. A snow pile, a broken rail, a dismissive phone call, a survey map, a forgotten temporary access note from years ago. None of those moments felt big on their own, but together they had built something expensive enough to force attention. When I finally signed, it wasn't satisfaction I felt. It was closure in the most practical sense, like locking a door that should have always had a working latch. After that, things shifted quickly into execution. Crews arrived within days to rebuild the bridge properly this time, not as a patch job or seasonal repair, but as permanent infrastructure. Steel supports replaced older worn timber, the foundation was reinforced, and for the first time since I had owned the property, the entry wasn't something I worried about every time the weather turned. Watching them work felt strange, almost surreal, because I remembered clearly how they had acted like this bridge was the problem in the beginning, as if its existence was an inconvenience rather than a fixed point in land ownership. Pine Harbor Lodge itself didn't escape unscathed. New Year's week, which was supposed to be their crown jewel season, turned into controlled chaos behind the scenes. Guests still arrived, but now every arrival came with friction, delayed transport, rerouted vehicles, staff carrying luggage through deep snow paths that suddenly felt a lot longer when the direct access wasn't there. Complaints started small, then multiplied, then turned into cancellations that no amount of discounting could fully stop. The worst part for them wasn't even the immediate financial loss. It was the timing, because reputation damage in hospitality spreads faster than any storm system, especially when it hits high-end guests who expect precision. Cole stopped calling after a while. The last time I saw him was from a distance near the maintenance yard, just standing there watching everything move without him in the center of it anymore. And I remember thinking how quickly authority disappears when the system it relies on stops cooperating. There was no confrontation between us after that. No final exchange, just distance. A week later, I walked across the rebuilt bridge early in the morning, coffee in hand like I always used to do before any of this started, and everything felt different even though it looked almost the same. The steel posts that once represented conflict were now officially integrated into the property boundary documentation, no longer symbols of tension, but markers of definition. And that's when the real thought hit me, not about winning or losing, but about how easily this entire situation could have been avoided if someone had simply respected a boundary instead of testing it repeatedly until it pushed back. That's the part one still think about the most. Because the truth is nothing about this required escalation at the beginning. It only required acknowledgement, and that's what never came. So when people ask me if I regret how far it went, I don't have a clean answer. Part of me thinks I did what anyone protecting their home would do when ignored long enough. Another part of me wonders if there was a quieter way this could have ended before it reached six figures and emergency construction crews. But then I remember standing there in that first storm, 3 hours into shoveling frozen road snow off my own bridge just to get inside my house, and I realized that moment already answered the question in a way nothing else could. If there's anything this whole winter taught me, it's that most conflicts don't explode suddenly. They accumulate quietly until someone finally decides the accumulation has gone far enough. And I still wonder how many other people are out there right now standing in front of their own blocked bridge, waiting for someone else to move first. So I'll leave it with this, not as a conclusion, but as a question that still doesn't feel fully settled in my head. Was this justice? Or just two sides finally paying the cost of not listening earlier? Because depending on how you look at it, both might be true at the same time. And if you've ever had a situation where someone treated your space like it was negotiable, I genuinely want to know how you handled it, because I have a feeling this kind of story is a lot more common than people admit.